All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CORES 101, an overview of the CORES certification. I wanted to start by thanking you all for joining us today, especially in the midst of such a confusing and challenging moment in our lives and in our work. I'm Alexandra Nassau-Brownstone. I'm the Director of Resident Outcomes in the CORES initiative at Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, otherwise known as SAFE. SAFE is a collaborative of 13 of the largest nonprofit affordable housing developers across the country. Our members own and operate over 140,000 rental homes in in 49 states, the British Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. In addition to being committed to preserving and expanding affordable housing options, our members are also committed to some form of service-enriched housing or resident services. For those of you who are not familiar with SAFE, we have a number of initiatives, including our national policy work, energy and water initiatives, health and housing, our resident outcomes initiatives, and the CORES certification, which really builds on the best practices found across the other bodies of our work. So I want to take a minute and do just a couple of housekeeping items. Due to the number of people on today's call, we have all the lines muted. On a personal note, I'm working remotely from home today, and I have a toddler who is supposed to be napping very nearby, and I just want to apologize in advance if there are any unexpected shrieks or other noises, hopefully not. If you do have a question, please feel free to use the question section on the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll also leave time at the end of the presentation to answer questions that we've received that haven't yet been addressed. During the Q&A portion at the end, we'll also allow, if anyone wants to raise their hand and use the raise the hand function, we'll probably be able to unmute people individually if you'd like to ask your question directly. So I wanted to start by talking about SAFE's Outcomes Initiative. SAFE started about 15 years ago. Our Outcomes Initiative launched probably 6 or 7 years ago, with a goal of really trying to demonstrate the value and impact of resident services at the national level. We believe that housing is fundamentally a platform for greater resident stability and economic mobility. The U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty identified 3 key indicators or pillars for economic mobility. 1 being economic success, 2 being valued in your community, and 3 is a sense of power and autonomy or control in your life as a resident. And so the idea of using housing as this platform becomes an even more powerful idea. Our outcomes work started as trying to demonstrate this impact of service-enriched housing at the national level, and part of it began with our members collecting indicators and metrics from across our work in different communities to try to demonstrate the story and tell the story of resident services and housing. And out of that work, with funding from the MacArthur Foundation, we developed a community of practice back in 2015 that was really designed to explore and then lay out the fundamental decisions and functions and capacities that are needed to support a robust system of resident services coordination. The framework that was developed out of that articulates at an organizational level how you think about integrating resident services into the development process, into the management of the property, and with asset management. So we had this goal, we built the framework, and that really led to the development of the CORES certification and the CORES initiative. And we had this goal to establish a common language and understanding and standards for the field to better support internal operations in an organization and to help communicate those guidelines and those standards and practices with external stakeholders, such as funders or investors, partners, including in the healthcare and education sectors, and to engage with policymakers and regulators. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about when we use the term resident services coordination, what we mean by this. And we're going to walk through the actual framework itself later because it really is the foundation of the CORES certification. But this higher level definition really gets at some of the key elements of what we mean, and we'll roll up into that framework. Historically, when resident services, the field began many, many years ago, it was frequently this sort of ad hoc approach to doing this work. You would take whatever funding you had available at whichever property you had it, or perhaps you identified a property where you had the greatest need and figured out a way to do it. And it's not to say that that still doesn't happen to some extent, but it's really evolved into something much larger that's not just the individual service coordinator working in isolation at the property. This system really includes both those frontline staff, which are critical to success. It doesn't work without having frontline staff engaging with your residents and in your community, but it also requires, depending on the size of the organization, corporate and regional staff that are supporting those frontline staff. It includes the partnership development, the community relationships that you guys have developed. It may include quality assurance and IT. It includes technology systems, and sometimes that's a more accessible and simple systems such as Excel for tracking the work that you're doing, or online data sharing, that you use SharePoint or other kinds of shared drives to share tools and documents. It can include more robust technology systems, including data measurement. It usually includes the integration of your property management systems as well. It obviously includes the actual programs and services being delivered at the property and the partners that support you all in doing that. The research and evaluation, understanding what's working at your property, what's the impact that you're having, also understanding what does that mean in the context of the community that you're working in. It obviously requires funding. That comes from a variety and frequently a patchwork of sources that are cobbled together to support this. Part of this initiative is trying to identify other sources of funding that could be replicated and scaled across properties and in different regions. And it also, the system of service coordination recognizes that there is organizational knowledge that gets developed over time, and that's hard to quantify and that's hard to capture. But some of the capacities and functions that we've developed through this work and are part of the requirements for the CORES certification try to ask an organization how they think about and how they approach developing systems to support their own institution in keeping this knowledge moving forward. We also know that the ways that organizations operationalize their programs take on a variety of different models. We try to simplify these into 3 buckets, and frequently organizations find themselves in one or another, or sometimes across multiple buckets or different models. So I'm going to take a minute to just walk through these 3, but we recognize that there are variations across a spectrum, and that you may also fit into one model at one portion of your portfolio and another model in a different part of the portfolio. That's not unusual. The direct model is for affordable housing owners who do everything internally. They have direct responsibility for all aspects of resident services in their organization. So they have organizational or corporate level staff that are dedicated to supporting resident services at the regional and property levels. They hire the frontline staff at the properties. They do all the data management, all the reporting, all elements of their programming internally. And that does not mean they don't work with partners. In fact, we expect that everyone has partners, external partners that they're working with. But as it relates to sort of the core resident services function, that's all internal for that organization. I'm going to skip to third party because it's usually helpful to do it this way. A third party is for an owner that may believe in and financially support resident services at their property. This is core to their mission, but they haven't developed their own capacity for delivering it. They engage with third-party providers to come in and do the services. And that third party has all of the key functions. They have the corporate level oversight. They have, if it's relevant, regional staff, and then they're also managing the frontline staff. This does not relate to, for example, a YMCA that may come in to do a specific fitness class at the property. This is really an external organization that has an expertise in providing services in an affordable housing context and understands the relationship and exchange with property management and other and development and other functions of the organization. And then finally, the hybrid model is for an affordable housing owner who may have developed some of these capacities at the corporate level. They are responsible for setting standards and guidance and managing the relationship with development, but perhaps they work with a third party, most frequently a property management company that they're using as a third party at their properties for the actual hiring of the staff. And there's sort of a co-management that happens with the frontline staff. That third party might be more responsible for sort of the HR functions. But in terms of the higher level goals and guidance, there is a co-management or an oversight that's happening from the owner. And again, as I said, there is quite a variation across these, and some organizations find themselves with a little bit of one foot in one model and one foot in the other. But we've developed these three models to really create sort of a framing for how an organization thinks about how they're going to develop this capacity. And also then for the CORES certification, we've developed three pathways. They're all equivalent certifications, but to try to approximate where an organization sits so they can apply through that model to really understand sort of how an organization manages those relationships. So how does this all relate to CORES, and what is CORES? CORES is a certification that was developed on the basis of this framework and on a basis on these capacities. It recognizes both owners and third-party providers that have developed this robust commitment, capacity, and competency in providing resident services coordination in an affordable housing context. CORES is a certification that applies at the organizational level. And if an organization is successful, it is encompassing of their entire portfolio, and the certification itself lasts for 5 years. This is not a property level certification. This is, an organization applying is asked to describe their standards and practices as an organization. CORES is one requirement currently in order to qualify for Fannie Mae's Healthy Housing Rewards ERS Enhanced Resident Services financing option. I'm not going to spend much time in this presentation talking about it. I'm sure many of you have heard about it. We have a handout in the panel, in the GoToWebinar panel, that provides some more information about this financing option. Essentially, it's a discount that, depending on the size of the loan, can equate to as much as $75,000 per year to cover the cost of resident services coordination at a property being financed with Fannie Mae. In addition, CORES has also been included in 2 state low-income housing tax credit QAP applications. The 2 states have implemented CORES in different ways, and we have had conversations with other state QAP or entities responsible for allocating the QAPs, or the low-income housing tax credits themselves. This is an evolving space, but there's a lot of interest both from states and actually from the healthcare space in thinking about how does an organization, how does an investor think about finding and partnering with housers that have this capacity to really do service coordination. In regards to the Fannie Mae financing, CORES is also, there is a property level certification, an ERS property certification that aligns to the CORES requirements as well. So the CORES certification itself is approximately 50 questions, regardless of which model you'd be applying under. It's a variety of different formats, text boxes, drop down, select all. There are a number of requested documents, and there are a number of required threshold documents. We'll walk through all of these as we go through the presentation. Most of the questions deal with an organization's capacity, their demonstrated process for approaching resident services, articulating how you all do the work that you do and demonstrating how it aligns to some of these standards and capacities. And there are 9 threshold or minimum requirements that come straight out of this framework for a system of resident services coordination. And finally, the cost for the certification is $5,500. Currently, Fannie Mae is covering the cost of this certification for entities that are eligible for their ERS financing. This is an opportunity that has a shelf life. We're not exactly sure how long that will continue. So if this is something that you think that your organization is interested in, I encourage you to pursue it sooner rather than later. I mean, the certification will always be available, but this is a pretty amazing opportunity to have Fannie Mae cover the cost. So the 9 threshold requirements. First, an organization, if they fall into the direct or hybrid model, has to have at least 3 years of experience as a multifamily housing provider. For organizations that are applying under the third-party model, they should have at least 3 years experience as a third-party provider. I will say that there are a couple of organizations that fall into both, that they first developed a capacity as a direct provider of services in their own housing and has then gone on to develop a model to serve as a third party for other owners. In this case, the requirement to have 3 years experience as a third party may be waived if the applicant can demonstrate years of experience under one of the other models. You need to have and demonstrate that you have a level of staffing that matches and the portfolio that you have. That you have to have frontline staff and corporate level support at some level. We do not require that there is resident services in 100% of your portfolio. In fact, we only require that there's resident services in more than one property in your portfolio. And this was designed really to be sensitive to the fact that organizations seeking this certification are of all different sizes and capacities. Some organizations have made it a decision to do resident services in 100% of their affordable housing. Some do an assessment and determine those with the highest needs. This can be a range from anywhere from perhaps 10% to 50 or 60% of the portfolio. This is really decided and evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But the essential piece is that an organization has resident services as a core function. It's aligned with their business model and their mission in some portion of the work that they do. We also look at an organization's capacity for thinking about addressing low participation with the programs and services. And it's not that we're penalizing anybody if there's low participation. This is really a measure and an indicator of how responsive and reflective an organization is thinking about, responding to changes in programming, changes in demographics, changes in the surrounding community as different programs and services change and evolve and close and open and become available to your residents. And also how you're thinking about engaging with the residents and soliciting their input, participation, collaboration in the development, design, and implementation of programming. And then there are 4 key property level documents or tools: the community scan, resident opportunities and needs assessment, property services plan, and resident indicators and analysis report that we require as thresholds. And we're going to talk about those in much greater detail. So now we're going to walk through the framework and really map how CORES aligns to it and draws from the guidance in this framework. So here it is. This is the framework. Again, this is available on the CORES website. We also have it available as a handout in today's webinar, along with a full set of guidelines. And we're going to walk through this in greater detail. But this is essentially a decision-making framework. How does an organization think about how they're going to approach resident services from that corporate or organizational standpoint? How does this align to your business model and your mission? How is it integrated into your development process and your management process for your properties? And then how do you determine and evaluate what the programs and services and staffing model is going to look like at a property by property basis? So those green bubbles at the top, we're zooming in right now, are typically what's happening at the corporate or regional level. It's how is an organization determining the higher level of goals for your resident services initiative? How is this integrated across your other business lines? In addition, this part is typically also then happens at a property by property basis. When you are considering an acquisition, a new development, a redevelopment within your portfolio, you should be looking at the surrounding community that the property sits in and trying to understand What are the community needs? What are the resources? Who are the potential providers and partners? Is this a property that has a lot of needs and opportunities for providing resident services? It should also be looking at the community level data. And so we've listed a number of different potential sources of community data. You should be engaging directly with residents to the extent that you're able to. And certainly looking at the broader community to understand directly from them what they see as the needs and opportunities. You're frequently getting some of the data from your market analysis or other kinds of local data. Enterprise has their free 360 report, which is a terrific analysis, sort of a snapshot that pulls from census and other data sources to try to get an understanding as a benchmark. You know, what's happening in the surrounding community? How do the residents at your property compare to what's happening in the surrounding community? Is there a nearby bus stop or other transit? Is it a food desert? What are the conditions? And then how do you use that information to think about what kind of model of service or support you might be developing for that particular community? So how does this relate for CORES? We've listed a number of documents below. The ones that have an asterisk are thresholds. These are the requirements that that an organization absolutely needs to submit in order to be passing. The organizational chart is demonstrating how resident services fits in your organization. What is sort of the big picture reporting structure and integration with your other departments? In addition, we do want to see some representation of the staffing structure within the resident services department. It doesn't need to have any kind of individualized information. If you have that, we're happy to see that. But we want to see who is responsible at the corporate level. Do you have regional staff? If you have 30 properties, how many frontline staff are supporting those 30 properties, assuming that you are saying that you're providing resident services in all of those properties? Or if you've made the decision that you're providing services in 10 or 15 of those properties, how does the staff support that need? We also ask for privacy protocols. This is not a required document, but a recommended document. What kind of guidance are you providing to your staff around storing data and sharing data? Because we have a requirement for frontline staff, we want to see the job description. In the scope of work, how do you view that role? What are the sort of basic requirements when you're seeking those staff? What are the core job functions? We ask for organizational goals or a theory of change or logic model. This is for those organizations that have developed at this sort of higher level. How are you thinking about resident services? What are the higher level goals for the initiative and the investment? Obviously, the goals at each property are going to be a little bit different and unique to those needs and opportunities and partnerships. But do you have some framing that you have as an organization to guide how you think about this at the property level and across different properties? We also ask for an example of what we call a community scan, and we'll talk about this more a little bit later. This sometimes happens at this higher sort of corporate level or regional level. It might also happen a little bit later depending on your process and depending on the nature of the deal. If it's an acquisition, you may not be able to develop this at this point. You may be developing this a little bit later when you have control of the property and you have greater engagement. So the next part of the framework is really thinking through the decision-making and steps at the property level. It's how is the organization taking all the information you gathered about the community and then marrying it and understanding the specific needs and opportunities at your property. And at a basic level, you should be looking at your property demographics and engaging directly with your residents to the extent that you are able to. This often takes the form of surveys, which are terrific. We are increasingly encouraging organizations to think about other ways of collaborating and engaging more directly with residents, doing focus groups or one-on-one assessments or offering other kinds of platforms or opportunities for residents to really have a voice in articulating what they see as being valuable to themselves and in their communities. It's the part of the process where you've already identified sort of the landscape of all those partners and resources that surround your property. Now is the time when you start to identify and solidify those partnerships. You develop MOUs, formalizing what those partnerships are going to be and creating mechanisms of accountability. You develop an actual plan for how you're doing this, laying out what's supposed to be happening, who's responsible for doing it, what the goals are at this property level, and how are you going to understand the impact of what you're doing at the property. And then you're assessing. You're as you've implemented and you're rolling out the programs, periodically throughout this process, you should be understanding how these programs and services are having an impact. And then, as I said, this is an evolving world, an evolving platform. Things will change. The resident composition at your property will change. The resources in the surrounding community will change. The interests will change. How do you understand what's working, what's not working, what needs to change, and then make those adaptations periodically so that the program plan evolves to meet those needs. So here are some of the key documents related to the CORES certification that align to this part of the framework. Again, you see the community scan. This is to reflect that for some organizations that happens at an earlier stage in the game, and in some cases this might happen a little bit later. The resident opportunities and needs assessment. We asked for an example of an executed MOU or service agreement. We asked for a property services plan and a resident indicators and analysis report, which demonstrates how you're thinking about and tracking impact at a single property. And then we also asked for an impact report that demonstrates how you're thinking about impact across multiple properties. And this might be that you have a program that you operate in multiple sites, and so you're trying to understand what that impact is. It might be something that you're developing for other kinds of stakeholders, for grants, for a board, for your own organization is really the goal, because this is supposed to help inform how you all are making decisions in your organization, figuring out how you allocate your resources, which programs and partnerships are needed, where you should be thinking about going in the future. So now we're going to walk through those 4 key documents and tools required for CORES in greater detail, because these are the ones that cause the greatest confusion for applicants in the application process. So the community scan is a document that we require gets updated at least once every 6 years. Resident opportunities and needs assessment at least once every 3 years. The property services plan, again, at least once every 3 years. And the indicators report should be updated at least once every year. For the purposes of CORES, when we're asking for these documents, we're asking the applicant to pick one property from within your portfolio where you're demonstrating this approach and this function for your organization. So each of these documents should be for the same selected property, because you're essentially showing these functions and these capacities, this cycle that we walked through for one property. You're showing how the data from the community scan and from the resident opportunities and needs assessment informs the development of your property services plan. And your indicators report is your own benchmark and your own understanding of what's working or not in the property services plan. So the community scan. This should be encompassing several elements. It should include identifying the resources and potential partners and assets in the community. What's the landscape that surrounds that property? It should also include the research, the community data, to understand the context and benchmarking. How does your population of residents compare to the community around that property? Are there trends around employment or food access or health services that really align, or that there's a gap, and that tells you something about some of the issues or opportunities for your resident services programming? In addition, to the extent that's possible, it really should make an attempt at trying to understand the alignment of those resources with your programs and services, and to try to understand who are the quality partners. Just because there's a free service in the community doesn't mean that that's a good fit for the work that you're trying to do at that property. The resident opportunities and needs assessment. This is really the opportunity to do a much deeper dive and understand what's happening in your own property itself. As a basic threshold, it should include some analysis of the demographics that you have for the residents of the property to understand who's living there. And that frequently comes straight out of your property management software. It should also include direct feedback from residents. That comes in the form often of resident surveys. It can come from resident meetings, focus groups, direct one-on-one assessments, other kinds of community meetings. We should understand in this how the information was obtained and what was learned. The surveys, I'll also say that there are a number of different kinds of surveys that exist. There are some that just focus on what programs and services are desired by residents, and that is very helpful. Increasingly, more organizations are also looking at doing some sort of resident satisfaction, understanding what residents like or don't like about in their community, and also trying to understand from surveys more about how residents perceive their own lives. What is their perception of safety? A lot of self-reported questions about access to healthcare or education, goals for the future, indicators around education. It sort of depends on the initiatives that you all are trying to operate. SAFE has a number of indicators that we've published on our website and some of the sample survey questions. And we'll talk more about this later, but on the CORES Resource Library, we've published a large number of surveys that other organizations have decided to share as an example so that organizations don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they're trying to create a program. The Property Services Plan. I like to talk about this as the roadmap. So you've done all this legwork, you understand, or you think you have a better understanding of what's happening in the broader community, and you have some sense of the resident demographics and identified needs, opportunities. What are you going to do about it? This is, in some ways, some of the most critical for ensuring that you keep your institutional knowledge. If you have staff turnover at the property, this is the document that somebody should be able to pick up and understand what's happening at that property, what's supposed to be happening, what were the goals, who's responsible for doing it, and how are you trying to understand that. We say that this, at a minimum, should be updated at least once every 3 years, and that's the requirement for CORES. It's a better practice and increasingly more common for organizations to do a review of this and an update annually because it really aligns to your budgeting process at the property as well. This should include 6 elements: your desired goals, a description of the programs and services, who provides the services, what is the staffing plan? Do you have 1 full-time staff person there? Do you have 1.5? Do you have external providers that are coming in that provide 15 or 20 hours of services in addition to your direct hire staff? If you have robust partnerships, what's their role? What programs are they supporting? We also ask an organization to think about what are the strategies that you have in place to address potential barriers. This could be cultural or language barriers or other kinds, it could be physical barriers. To try to identify, if you know that your population has some of these barriers or challenges, how are you thinking strategically about that? And they should also include a budget. You know, what are the resources that support this work? And the final key document is what we call the Resident Indicators and Analysis Report. This should align with the Property Services Plan and the goals. If you say that you're hoping to have an impact in these 3 core areas, the indicators should help you understand if you're moving the needle against those goals. And this is really reflective of whatever you identify as the programs and services and what the goals are. It should demonstrate the impact. It should show analysis of that impact, and it should really be used as a functional tool for your organization to inform future changes. So you have these 4 key documents. And you may have a document within your organization that very closely aligns and encompasses all of the functions that I've just laid out. And you may have 4 distinct documents. Or you may, and this is more common, you may have multiple documents or tools that when combined demonstrate the functions for each of these. And that is absolutely fine for CORES. That is the most common scenario. What we say in these cases is that when you're developing the materials for an application, you should package those multiple tools, documents, and templates into one upload for each of these. So for community scan, maybe there's 2 or 3 documents that you're combining into one PDF and uploading. Do that, include a cover sheet with an explanation of how these elements combine to meet the functionality that we're looking for. Same is true for the resident opportunities and needs assessment, property services plan, and the resident indicators report. The other thing is that you may have a document that really combines multiple functions in learning. It could be that you have a community scan and resident opportunities and needs assessment, and that data and those functions are in one document. Or you might have one document that includes the community scan, the resident opportunities and needs assessment, and the property services plan all in one. This is also fine. What's important is that when we get those documents as part of the application, that we can understand and recognize where these different elements that we're looking for exist. So, as I already shared, there are approximately 50 questions. In addition to the core thresholds, the questions really deal with a number of other competencies. We're looking at your organizational structure to try to understand how resident services fits in the model, the business model, and the mission. How does your property portfolio and your staffing structure and how you think about that staffing structure align? We're thinking about, do you have higher level organizational goals that help to refine that and articulate that across your different lines of business? We're thinking about the staffing infrastructure, the capacity, the training and support, accountability measures that you develop, both at the corporate or regional levels and at the front line. We're looking at how you think about scaled systems, because the idea of CORES is that you are creating this larger system of resident services coordination, that you think about how these systems can be replicated and scaled in whatever size portfolio you have. And these systems might be technology, but they can also be other kinds of processes or documents. We recognize that because of the different scales of organizations, that these systems take on different forms. We're looking at how do you use the community level data, the resident demographics, direct feedback from residents to inform your programmatic decision-making at properties. We're looking at how you develop and how you manage those partnerships. How do you think about accountability? How do you think about those goals? How do you formalize some of those measures? And also think about the protections that you need to do as an organization with real liability exposures. We ask about how you use data and how you track and understand the impact so that you can inform the decision-making for your programming. And we also ask about how you approach sustainably funding resident services. We realize that this is one that causes great anxiety for many applicants, and we realize that the reality of the field is that it is frequently organizations being very creative about cobbling together different sources from property operations and corporate proceeds and grant dollars and partnership and in-kind donations and perhaps using income from other amenities at your property. All of those are fine. We are looking for an organization to really think critically about and be moving towards, when feasible, how do you more sustainably fund resident services, and how do you think about the risk mitigation for when and where you may have a cut in funding. How do you manage that with your residents, and how do you keep and sustain programming going with the ebbs and flows of funding? And finally, we really also want to understand how an organization is thinking about operationalizing and demonstrating resident-centered approach to their programming and services. So the certification application, as I mentioned, there are these 3 models. As a minimum, we're looking for all organizations to meet the required thresholds, those 9 thresholds. In addition, the organization needs to meet minimum points across each of these sections and score 40 points across all the sections. So what I mean by sections is the ones in red, A, B, C, D, E, and F. You should be scoring the minimum points in each one of those sections. You may also notice that if you tallied those minimums up, you don't hit 40 points. You hit, there's a bit of a range, but around 32, 33 or more points. The expectation is that even if an organization is hitting those minimum points, there is probably one or more areas where you have greater capacity and greater strength. So we expect that organizations pick up points across these different sections to meet that 40-point minimum. So the CORES application process. The first step is going to our website and submitting a pre-screen application. This basically is the organization self-certifying that you meet all the requirements and believe that you are a good candidate for the certification. CORES will review this within 3 to 5 business days. As I mentioned, right now Fannie Mae is covering the cost of certification for a limited time. If an applicant meets the requirements for CORES and is eligible through Fannie Mae for the financing, they will be given access to the full application. If the applicant is either ineligible for ERS financing or they've applied after the period that Fannie Mae has stopped covering the cost, you'll be directed to a PayPal portal to make payment before being given access to the application. I will also note that Fannie Mae is only covering the cost for direct and hybrid models. They don't pay for third parties. So all third parties, when they apply, would be directed to the PayPal portal directly. Once payment is received or you're given full access, the organization completes the CORES application. We have a 6-month window. We really are trying to encourage organizations to wait till you're really ready to apply so that the application process doesn't drag on. But if an application goes inactive and hasn't, submitted within 6 months, it will be deactivated. You will get a notification email letting you know that's about to happen, but we really are trying to enforce that. Once the organization submits the application, CORES staff will review it. We usually do a really pretty quick turnaround within about a week to do an initial review. Sometimes it's 2 weeks because there's an opportunity for us to follow up with the applicant. If an organization submits something and there's a question where maybe you didn't understand what we were asking for, or somewhere in your answers it looks like you have one process in place and then someplace else somehow the answer doesn't make sense, there's an opportunity for CORES to schedule a TA call and to do some direct engagement. And in that case, we will then revert the application back and allow the applicant to make some updates. So it's not like a grant application where you submit it and that's the final opportunity. But we really, again, are trying to push organizations to get, as close to a final product as possible. And you can always reach out in the application process if you have a question. CORES staff will respond. So once CORES staff has what we view as a fully complete application after those updates are made, the turnaround time for review is 4 to 6 weeks. CORES staff does an initial scoring. It's scored by more than one staff person and makes either a recommendation for full certification, provisional certification, which is available in some cases, and is not accepted by the state QAPs, but is accepted for Fannie Mae's Healthy Housing Rewards Initiative, or a denied certification. And then we share the scoring and analysis with a peer review committee, which is made up of organizations in the resident services and affordable housing community and industry. That peer review committee reviews the application, all the materials, along with the recommendations of the CORES staff, and makes the final decision. At the end of that, the applicant is notified by email on their application status. So we've covered a lot of the information, but there is just an incredible wealth of information on coresonline.org, our website. It covers all of the eligibility and requirements. It gives step-by-step guidance, both for the application itself, and many of the materials are FAQs. There's a glossary of terms. There's also copies of the actual certification itself. The resource guide is the one I really want to feature. This is when you go to the website, that resources, the light bulb at the top right, go to that page. This is free. There is no requirement to be a CORES certified or organization or even an applicant. This is really meant so that organizations can develop their capacity in the field, regardless of seeking the certification. Those documents that I walked through, there are examples of those on here, so you can understand how other organizations have approached this. There's specific CORES guidance, there's relevant research and case studies, there's sample job descriptions and MOUs. This is something that's getting updated every month with new resources. So when you go to the apply part of the page, this is where you select which model you apply for. Either there's one portal for the direct and hybrid and one portal for the third-party model applicants. This is also where you can download a copy of the actual certification questions. Those are not a secret. You can download them in either Excel, which is easier to sometimes read through as a snapshot, what the different questions being asked are, or a Word doc. And we encourage organizations to download those to start working on your application externally before you do it in the portal, and save copies of all of your answers within your own files so that you can make changes and edits. You have that historical knowledge. It's just much easier that way. So when you do the application, you will be entering in all that information in the online portal. So in addition to lots of information on CORES Online, I've also provided a link to Fannie Mae's Healthy Housing Awards program. And as I said, that there are some handouts attached to this webinar. But I'd like to stop here and open it up for any questions that have either come in through the chat box, or if anyone has questions they want to ask now, we'd love to answer any of your questions.
Hey, Alexander, we have one question that has come through so far during the presentation. They just were asking how many states recognize the certification in low-income housing tax credits.
Great, great question. Right now it's 2 states, Maryland and Virginia. And we've had some conversations with another number of other states. So that could evolve in the near future, but right now it's just the 2. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to either type it in the questions box or go ahead and raise your hand, and we can go ahead and unmute you. So we'll give you just another minute or 2 as you're processing the information. All right, well, it doesn't sound like there are any other questions today. You please feel free, send us an email, cores@safenet.org, if you do have other questions, or if you have questions about any of the materials that were included as handouts today or materials on the website. I want to thank you all for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day.